read that Bible and you thought, oh, this is what it means. No. Your pastor will quickly correct you and let you know it means what he thinks.
Well, and even to think about, like, I look at like the way it reads, and Jesus comes in and he tells basically the people who have created his temple, his rules, his regulations, and he starts saying, you're a whitewashed viper, or a whitewashed tomb, you're a viper. And like basically it's the boss talking to his employees and being like, you're a worthless employee. You know, how dare you say this? And I look at like Malachi when it talks about you have mishandled the tithes and the offerings. You've robbed God. That was the priests that are robbing God. Right. Mm-hmm. And then you look at like Matthew where he talks about, how wicked are you that put the law on people? How wicked are you that you teach this? How wicked are you that you say we need to do X, Y, Z, and you don't even do it yourself, and you're the wicked one? And that's impressive to me, because basically I read it as, if we are putting the law on other people, we're considered wicked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. We live in a very black and white world, and this is part of just how humans have developed. You know, so we have developed in a way that our culture has become very black and white. So the last kind of couple of thousand years, humanity as a whole, there's a whole branch of study called human psychological development, and it's how people develop psychologically. So you can look at a small baby, there's not much psyche there at all. They can't even tell the difference between their arm and a blanket. If they bite their arm and they bite a blanket, they can't actually tell which one's which, right? So that's until about 6 months, right? Babies there's not much happening in there for a while, right? There's a lot happening, but they don't have much psyche for a while. And then they slowly start to develop their own psyche. They start to realize, oh, ow, that hurt. Oh, maybe it's a hand. That doesn't hurt. Well, maybe it's something else. It's not me. But even up until about 2 or 3, they can't tell the difference. They can say, oh, that over there is different from my body. But, you know, when I scream and my mum goes to get milk, I actually think I'm going to get milk. It can't even tell the difference between its mum and itself. It still thinks its mum is just an extension of itself. And so there's these developments, and then it starts to realize, oh, I have my own ego and I can get my own way. And it develops and it figures that out. And then it goes, well, me getting my own way, it's nice, but sometimes it doesn't work very well and everyone hates me because I'm screaming and yelling and saying no too much. And so there's a bit more stability, and around that age of 4 or 5 up until early teens, they start to just kind of work as part of the family. They realize the rules, they accept the rules that are given. They're kind of like, yeah, okay, that makes sense, okay. Or they might ask why, but they quickly accept what mom and dad say is true. And then they develop as teenagers, right? We all know what teenagers are like. They start to realize maybe mom and dad don't know everything. And the painful truth is they're right. We don't. Yeah. But it sucks, right? Because suddenly they think they're know-it-alls and they know everything. And, and then we develop again and we grow up a bit and we realize, oh, actually, mom and dad knew more than they were talking about. And they did the best they could. And actually, I don't know everything either. And I'm trying to figure out what's going on. And I'm not much better than the 5-year-old that used to ask questions, if I'm honest. Mm. And so we grow and we develop. And at different stages of our development, we can only operate the way we are. You wouldn't look at a small toddler and expect them to operate the same way as you would a 28-year-old. You would expect them to have different capacities to cope with pain, to cope with death, to cope with algebra. These are different people at different stages in their life. And it's not that you would say a toddler is worse than a 28-year-old. A toddler's just a toddler. Of course, that's what they're at. And so what's interesting is when you look at civilizations, they're just big groups of people developing. And so cultures develop in the same way. And so you look back to very early history, people were very, very primitive. And they weren't capable of very complex thought, very complex ideas and things like that. It was hard for us to conceptualize that. We can't really go back and imagine what that's like. My wife's a teacher. I'll give you an example. My wife's a teacher for small children. And so she has to teach them things like addition, like 2 + 3 is 5. And we can not really conceive what it is to not be able to figure that out. I'm like, what? 2 + 3 is 5. Or I can look at my fingers and go 1, 2, 3, 5, right? But there was a time where that didn't logically make sense. You couldn't fathom it. And so we forget that there's times in history where they couldn't fathom certain concepts that we just take for granted now. And so the point being that as we develop, we go through these different stages. And the stage that we've been in for the last kind of maybe 2.5 years, it's called traditional stage. And it's a stage where society started to get rules and regulations, and it would put a king or a pope or a priest or a Bible or a code, a code of laws or something. That was the authority, and the society would do what it said. And it's because That's required when we mentioned in a prior podcast. When you go from living as nomads and kind of warrior tribes to like living as empires of a million people, you need some rules, you need some regulations, you're going to probably need some police, you might need some healthcare, you might need some government, you might need these kind of structures. And we still live in that stage a lot of the world. And the church is deeply at that stage. It really requires some rules and some regulations. And when you're at that stage mentally, when you're psychologically at that stage, and you'll notice when you have children in that age bracket, that bracket from like maybe age 4 up to about age 11, you know that rules and stability make them feel safe. And they need certainty. They can't cope with gray area. You know, you try and teach a 8-year-old, well, it's not really like that. It's just this big quantum gray area in the middle of these two options. And they just kind of go, they just kind of have a bit of a meltdown. They can't cope with these complexities. And so I think we have to have a bit of grace towards the church, where most people in the church probably are at this stage where they find their safety with certainty, security, rules, regulations, and so that's what their Christianity becomes. It's what their faith becomes, and it's natural. The problem is that maybe people like myself and you, Ben, and maybe some of the people who are listening, if you've listened long enough to this podcast, you're probably not at traditional stage anymore. The next stage after traditional is modern, and modern stage happened around the Enlightenment. And what it is it no longer finds value. Its chief value is no longer in stability and certainty and safety. Its chief value is finding truth and exploring and questioning. Okay, and so when that lights me up. Just those words, I'm like, oh yeah. You say safety and certainty, I'm like, meh, who cares? But you say exploring and questioning and finding truth, and I'm like, yes, let's do it. And so people that are at that stage are going to clash quite often with the church, because the church is scared, right? So the pastor is scared of you using your phone in the service. Why? Because you're going to Google what he just said, right? So if he says, it's just clear the Bible says, you're going to burn in hell if you don't say this prayer, and you can go, when did we start believing in praying a prayer to be saved? And it's like, we started believing when this guy did it at 1824. I don't take that date, I just picked one out. But, it's going to quickly highlight that some of the stuff your pastor says is just total BS.
Well, and also one of my friends has told me that a certain people that he goes into the service and he says he checks to see if it's plagiarized.
Wow.
And he says more times than not,
yeah, absolutely,
this guy's plagiarized.